Hello and welcome back. Today's guest is Alexander Matheou. He's a friend of mine and the director for the Red Cross for 38 countries in the Asia Pacific region. Just about every war zone that's existed this century, he's been there. Just about every tyrant, political leader, dictator that we see on the news, he's met them. And just about every world crisis that's happened within his remit, he's been there to help pick up the pieces. Personally, I find it so hard in this day and age to believe what you see, believe what you read in the paper, believe what you see on the news or on social media. And it was great and eye-opening for me to have someone who's experienced pretty much every side of the coin that there is to experience firsthand and have him tell me what's really going on. He answers questions like, how close are we to another world war? What needs to be done on the global scale to de-escalate the conflict that's going on right now? How having such a traumatic job that exposes you to catastrophe can be so rewarding, and how to continue with a normal life when that's your job. I took so much away from this episode. One of the biggest was that I am very focused on self-development and should perhaps be more focused on making an impact on the wider scale and in my community and the world around me. I hope you take as much away from this as I do. He's incredibly articulate and just an all-round good human. So I really hope you enjoy the episode. If I could just ask one favor, if you could please drop a like, a follow, a subscribe on whatever platform you're on. It is all the motivation I need to keep doing this and keep speaking to some incredible guests. So thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy. So, I think a good place to start is, obviously I know you quite well at this point, but the guests won't. You are a director of the Red Cross, and would you mind just giving us a bit of your backstory and what your job involves?
So the Red Cross movement is a bit complicated. It has three components in it. One deals with conflict. That's the International Committee of the Red Cross. One is a host Red Cross or Red Crescent in every country. British Red Cross, Malaysian Red Crescent, and one is the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. That's a secretariat to 191 organizations, and we are set up to support those organizations respond to every natural and man-made disaster in the world. And I coordinate 38 countries of the Asia Pacific region, all of those 38 Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, and our job is to respond to every disaster.
I've always had suspicions that the way our media reports things is perhaps a bit one-sided, and how things actually happen are a bit less black and white. And you are one of the few people on the planet that has seen every side of the coin imaginable with your own two eyes. You've been to pretty much every war zone that's existed in this century. You've met some of the people that are purported in the press to be the most villainous dictators going. How accurate is our media's representation?
Well, I would say two things on that, one of which is not new and one of which is new. So it's not new that every broadcast, every media outlet describes the world through the perspective of a political viewpoint or a country. If you lived in the 20th century and you lived in the Soviet Union, you would have been exposed to a media narrative which described the US as an evil empire, as democracies, as largely a mask for imperialism, against the much more noble effort to create the fairer societies of the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc. That would have been your narrative. If you lived in the US, you'd have believed that the Soviet Union was the evil empire, that the democracies were the ones representing a peaceful way of living against socialist aggression, and you would have just assumed that your viewpoint was true. You know, fast forward a few years, and that's pretty much where we are now. If you live in the US today, you will probably think that Russia is an evil empire led by an evil dictator, intent on threatening the lives of peaceful-minded people. If you live in Moscow, on the contrary, you will think that the US is still an imperialist power, interfering around the world and destroying the prospects of happiness for peaceful-minded people. And there's nothing new about the fact that your overall narrative is a sort of groupthink, depending on where you're born and where you live. What is new is that is now sort of compounded 100 times by the fact that we access social media through our phones and computers, and algorithms compound things that we think we are investigating for ourselves, but in fact are being fed to us. So if, for example, today your starting point is that because of your groupthink of where you were born, you believe that Israel was founded by a desperate, persecuted people who went back to their ancestral lands and against all odds managed to create a country that became a democracy and a successful economy, surrounded by aggressive neighbors determined to destroy them, and that they clearly have a right to defend themselves. If that's your starting point, then probably the first link you're going to press on the news to explore what's happening is something that describes Israel as the victim or something about Israel's right to defend itself. If, on the other hand, and that's probably what your starting position, obviously we live in Israel, but if you live in the US or the Pacific Islands or some parts of Europe, if on the other hand your starting point is that the Palestinians were illegally evicted from their ancestral homelands, that they have been forced to live in subhuman conditions for generations and have watched their prospects of return home gradually taken from them, their dignity constantly sort of humiliated and harassed, their lives of their loved ones taken from them. If that's your starting point, that great injustice and their right to claim some form of freedom and dignity and home for themselves, you're probably going to press a different link, something that shows the Palestinians as freedom fighters and victims. And that will then trigger the algorithm that will give you more of that. And soon enough, your view will be compounded so many times by the same perspective that you will find it difficult even to see someone with a different perspective. And it might push you on the streets to fight for what you believe in. And exactly the same on the other side as well. If you ask me what my experience of that is that in almost all cases, the reality is much more nuanced and much more complex than you will ever get by looking at a single viewpoint on a problem that actually has many different angles to it. So that, I think, is the challenge. That one, the groupthink that naturally comes from the media environment in which you're born, and now, secondly, compounded by the fact that algorithms just deepen and narrow our perspectives, even if that's what we're trying not to do when we dig for ourselves.
It's such a problem now, and we see it in politics as well, that, as you say, our viewpoint gets compounded, and we have a natural tendency to read any headline that supports our viewpoint as news, and anything that would contradict it as brainwashing propaganda. That's generally the first stance when we see these things. And as you say, we then go down the rabbit hole of teaching the algorithm the stuff that we do believe and that we will read, and then that creates a fairly one-sided viewpoint. And it's got to the point now, you see it in politics, we are now the most polarized world that we have ever been, where people are so far left and so far right. They meet each other in real life and they can't have a conversation because they think, how could this person be so ignorant that they haven't read everything that I've read, but they've been reading completely the opposite and been getting compounded and having their brain trained by the algorithm, that it can make the middle ground so hard to find these days.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And if there's something I've learned through visiting the places that you've described, it is precisely that the people inherit stories. Their stories are now compounded by the social media and the algorithms that you've described. And you cross the border and the same stories are told with a different history and a different emotional baggage, and now different algorithms compounding it. And that is why one of the reasons we are so polarized at the moment.
One of the things that you said to me when we were having a conversation yesterday was about the belief of the people on each side, because no one thinks that they're the villain in this. And we label certain groups terrorists, and we assume that they commit acts of terrorism knowing that it's terrorism, right? But as you say, they are fed a completely different viewpoint. They have access to stories that are potentially hidden from us and are brought up in a different echo chamber.
I think that's a helpful way of looking at the major crises that the world is experiencing today, the ones that are at least most prominent in the news. If you look at Russia or Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, or now Israel, Lebanon, these are both conflicts rooted in different perspectives about who is the victim and who is the aggressor, who has caused the problem, at what point in history, and who is continuing to compound it by their behaviors today. and who ultimately is threatened by what's happening. And they have very different versions of that. And, it's not for me to say which one is right and wrong, but I think the only way to be constructive, the only way not to be part of the problem, at least, is to be curious enough to try to understand the other story and to recognize that deepening the aggression and the anger and the determination to confront is not going to end well. Ultimately, it's going to have to end in some form of deliberation. And news or perspectives or even our own participation that contributes towards that awareness, I think, is more helpful than rigidly taking sides and sort of glorifying being on one side as opposed to the other.
And you have to maintain a point of neutrality as well in your job, right? Because your objective is to help the people that need it, regardless of what side of the fence that they're on. And in order for you to have access to do that, you need to make sure that you aren't seen to be taking sides, right?
That's a specific feature of the organization that I work for. It has a fundamental principle of neutrality. And that doesn't mean that we don't care who's right or who's wrong. It doesn't mean that we don't have personal opinions. On some of those crises we just talked about, I actually have strong personal opinions. But when it comes to work, then, I keep quiet about it, because ultimately both sides need to accept the Red Cross as a neutral and impartial organization that is focused only on alleviating the suffering of whoever's suffering on either side. And if one of those sides of a conflict, protagonists in a conflict, were to believe that the Red Cross somehow is on the other side, they would naturally not trust it to have access to its wounded, its hospitals, its prisons, or wherever vulnerable people were located. So there is a strict rule about not appearing to be on one side or another. That is also captured in the Geneva Conventions, which is designed to recognize the Red Cross as a neutral and impartial actor. Of course, in practice, it can be more complicated than that. Not everybody believes in that neutrality, but sticking to it as well as we possibly can has enabled us to work with people on all sides of a conflict all around the world.
And if you didn't, not only could it potentially hamper your ability to get access to the people that you're trying to help, it could also endanger you and your colleagues, right? If you were in active war zones and are purported or perceived by one side to be siding with the enemy.
And that's not just an idle threat. That has happened. If you look at the long history of the Red Cross, tragically, people have been either killed because they've been in the wrong place or the wrong time, targeted because the neutrality was not believed in, or sometimes murdered because they were really not convinced that they were neutral and impartial. So it's a serious business to try and stay and be perceived as neutral.
100%. You obviously get to go to the front lines of these places and see what's happening for yourself. But for people at home that obviously don't have that ability or desire, but would like to have a more neutral or balanced opinion, how would you recommend they go about taking in news?
I think it starts with the recognition that we don't really know what's going on usually if we're far away. We can't really know. We can't know because we've seen a headline or listened to a news flash for 5 minutes or read one article. If we are curious about what's going on, we should try to understand the different viewpoints that have caused this crisis. We should try to understand how it's being experienced by both sides. We should try to find journalists who are trying to authentically bear witness as well as they can to what they're seeing, whichever side of the conflict that they are on, and to recognize that we will never probably know fully the multiple ways this conflict is experienced, or all the factors that are in reality driving it. Because in the media, conflicts and crises are driven by simple things, black and white, good and evil. These guys are bad, these guys are good. In reality, it's always more complex than that. So just recognizing that it is going to be more complex than you can gather through a quick snippet of information. Having the curiosity and the empathy to dig further, to try to be balanced in the news that you're watching, not to rely on a single source, and to recognize that if you are relying on social media, you are being You are trapped in an algorithm that's going to reinforce your initial curiosity about, or initial conviction about the cause of the conflict or crisis. I think all those things, though, that awareness is important, and try not to become part of the problem, because ultimately all of these crises need to end in some form of peace. There'll be some principles around how that peace is achieved, and sometimes those principles need to be adhered to even forcefully. But ultimately, people shouldn't die needlessly. Parents don't want to lose their children. Brothers and sisters don't want to lose their siblings. People don't want to see their cities destroyed. If those things can be avoided, we should try to avoid them, and not being part of the problem by being so fiery on one side that we're creating expectations from the governments that where we live, that they must participate one way or another. I think that sort of responsibility is important.
I've experienced that firsthand. I did a charity fundraiser for an animal shelter here earlier this year.
Okay.
And I had quite a lot of angry messages with the fact that I was raising money for animals when there's all this conflict going on, and I was staying quiet about it. And as you say, like it's so hard to navigate that, right? Because you're dealing with someone that has just completely one-sided in their opinion of what's going on, and then expects you to join them on that. And that can be hard. And the first experience I had on this, there's a wonderful documentary, actually. It's called The Social Dilemma. I can't remember which platform it was on. I think it was on Netflix, and it came out perhaps about 5 years ago. And that was the first time I'd been made aware of how the algorithm was affecting my thoughts, my feelings, my opinions. And then I went and stayed with a friend of mine called Patrick in Tenerife. And I logged on to his smart TV and opened his YouTube, and the suggestions that came up. And at that point, my algorithm was so leftist. It was just constantly feeding me things about how Trump is the biggest dirtbag on the planet and everything else. And I opened YouTube on his, and it was talking about all these amazing things that Trump had done. And I felt like I was living in an alternate reality. And that's literally the truth of it, is we spend so much time on social media that it is now a form of our reality. And other people are literally living different versions of it from you because they're receiving completely different content.
Yeah, and Trump is a good example of it, because he tends to evoke extreme opinions one way or another. But Russia and Ukraine, Israel, Gaza particularly, may be another case of extreme opinions held one way, and with an inability to be, or an inability maybe, or just lack of opportunity to be exposed to the other side.
You touched on Trump, or I touched on Trump there. The US obviously has an upcoming election. What are the ramifications for this election on the global scale?
The US is not the only superpower in the world anymore, and we are still living in the forming of a more multipolar world, which is happening before our eyes, and we don't know how that's going to finish. But for now, the US is still the most powerful and influential country in the world, with a giant global footprint. And if you look at even just the crises we've been talking about this morning, Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, the US has a huge footprint on both of those. So I think it's fair to say that whatever happens in the election in November, one way or another is going to shape whether conflict is, if the conflicts are reconciled, or whether they are prolonged, or whether they grow in their impact. I think it's impossible for us to say which way it's going to go depending on who wins. There are many elections going on in the world in the coming months. I think that's probably the most important one for the world. But in all cases, I think we should all hope that the people of the US, but the people of whoever making choices about who's going to govern their country, will choose people who are going to work for peace, who will not exacerbate the nuclear risk that faces us all at the moment, who will be aware of the climate risks that are going to change all of our lives and will want to play a constructive role in mitigating those risks, who will be aware to the extent to which artificial intelligence algorithms are going to change and shape our lives, and will have honest conversations with us about that. Leaders who are talking about those important things, and in talking about those important things, not just from their national perspective, but from a global perspective, because none of those big issues of nuclear risk, climate change, artificial intelligence. None of them are local problems. I mean, they can be experienced locally, but ultimately, even if one country focuses on them and comes up with great policies and solutions, unless their neighbors do, it won't really have an impact. So it's got to be leaders who are interested in global collaboration and global solutions for global problems. Let's hope whoever they choose is that way inclined.
That's it, because I'm obviously not a US person myself. I do have some US clients, but my care for the election isn't about how the US is governed, so to speak, but it's about how it will affect worldwide problems. And you mentioned nuclear risk there. How serious is that threat at the moment?
Well, it feels for all of us, I think, more real than it would have done for decades. I think our parents, or even myself as I was growing up, it felt real because we were exposed to the Soviet threat. For a long time, it appears that threat receded. There was always the risk of an isolated nuclear incident through a terrorist threat, but that never was a looming part of our lives. Now I think it is not at all difficult to envisage how a conflict could become nuclear, even in the near future. There's nothing inevitable about it. Nothing is inevitable in history until it happens. And this can also be stopped with the right diplomacy, because I don't think anybody wants it. But whether geopolitics can be aggravated to such a degree that it becomes more likely than not that it will happen is now at least very easy to imagine. So going back to your previous question, I think whoever's elected to any of the major offices in the world would hope that mitigating that risk is going to be a priority.
Where is the biggest nuclear threat right now?
It's from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I mean, there are other places it could come from, because the Korea Peninsula is also extremely tense. But if you were to ask me where is the greatest risk today, it's how the Russia-Ukraine conflict will evolve in the next 12 months.
The Korea border, we're talking about North and South Korea there, that involves the US as well, right? The US, I think, has got a big part to play in most of the global conflicts that are happening at the moment. And a point that was in the news, a few years ago and isn't so much now, is Afghanistan, where the US and the UK had quite a big involvement and have left. And it's been branded by the media, and again, taking it with a pinch of salt, by a bit of a disaster in what's happened there since. But you've been back to Afghanistan since everyone left, right?
Several times, yeah.
What's your take on what's happening there at the moment?
Well, Afghanistan is in a terrible situation, but the reasons for that are multiple. It's been invaded by the Soviet Union. It was used as a basis for a very violent proxy war against the Soviet Union. Once the US sort of retracted from that proxy war and the Soviet forces withdrew, the country was run by very well-armed warlords who fought it out amongst themselves for several years, causing great suffering for the people who lived there. And that was when the Taliban first emerged. It is one of the cases where it is at least helpful to understand the other point of view, whether or not you sympathize with it. The Taliban will see themselves not as the villains that we see them to be. Naturally, people tend not to see themselves as villains. When they were formed in the 1990s, the country was being ripped apart by civil war. It was unsafe to travel. Kidnapping and murder, crime were rampant, and a small group of Taliban's another word for students, got together and tried to discuss how they would bring law and order, at least to their immediate environment in Kandahar. They managed to bring some stability to a few villages, and soon after that, other villages started saying, we'll come under your wing as well, because it's safer to be under Taliban rule than under the rule of warlords. And bit by bit, probably without a grand plan to begin with, their human resources grew significantly until they had a significant enough army, not just to focus on Kandahar, but on the rest of the country as well. What they brought with them was a view of law and order, which came from Sharia law, basically. And that had a terrible impact on women, not so much women in the south who were living under that culture anyway, but certainly once they got into the cities, it had a very negative impact on women in cities like Kandahar or Mazar or Herat, because that culture was not part of their heritage. If you meet them again now, because I met them back in back in those times as well, but if you meet them now, it's a new narrative, but very familiar. Our country was occupied. Our country was run by warlords, again, funded by the US and the UK. Crime was rampant. Drug abuse was rampant. Corruption was everywhere. We were kicked out, and we've mobilized ourselves together to take the country and restore proper Afghan law and order to Afghanistan. And we are the Davids that have taken on this Goliath and won. You know, you can hear that and at least understand where they're coming from, whether or not you agree with it. What makes it more complicated is that they still, despite what they said originally when they took control in August 2021, have introduced severe human rights restrictions against women, which, not surprisingly, has burnt bridges for any possible diplomatic relationships with most of the outside world. At least fully open and functioning diplomatic relationships, they still maintain dialogue. For us, it is not, and so for many countries, I said, we'll not work with them. For the Red Cross, it's not an option to say things like that, because we can't say, we don't like your particular attitude to this, and therefore we're going to stop providing medicines to your women and children. We're going to withdraw food support for your most hungry people, and we're going to stop providing shelter for destitute people who live on the street, because who are you punishing if you do that? You are betraying the very purpose of your organization if you take a position like that.
You're punishing those that are already punished.
Exactly. So you have to start your diplomacy on areas where at least there's some potential for agreement. Now, on the issue of women, of course, there's no fundamental agreement on the role and the rights of women, but you might agree that, okay, do you want your women to be hungry and starving? No. So we can continue to feed women, yes. Do you want your women to die needlessly of treatable diseases? No. So we can set up medical facilities that are accessible to women, yes. Do you want women to be destitute on the streets and subject to sexual violence? No. So we can talk about shelters for destitute women that provide some form of protection. In other words, you can find some things that you agree on that at least give you a starting point to start services that provide some protection for the most vulnerable, even if there are many things that you don't agree on.
Are there any conflicts going on in the world? Because I know from talking to you personally that you're constantly on the move and flying to multiple countries every month. Are there any conflicts going on at the moment which affect the global scale, which perhaps aren't as well publicized as they should be?
Mm-hmm. There definitely are, and of those, Sudan would be the top. There are many actually, but Sudan is particularly stark because in scale of destruction, in death, in suffering, and in violence, it is absolutely comparable with the worst of what we're seeing in Gaza or in Ukraine, and yet it's almost nowhere in the news, which is telling again that our news does focus on a geopolitics that resonates with your own domestic audience, often for historical reasons, or if there's a direct threat from that conflict to your country. It's not really driven by the level of suffering. It's where the suffering is taking place and who is suffering. And Sudan is definitely a victim of that.
What's happening in Sudan?
It's a civil war where the government has been overthrown and different armed groups are contending for influence and power over the country, causing huge destruction, famine, possibly even genocide.
Have you been on the ground while this has been going on?
In Sudan, no. I don't cover Sudan.
Okay.
I have been to Sudan, but in this job, I cover the 38 countries of Asia Pacific.
Are there any experiences that you've had in the last 20 years or so where you feel like your safety has felt more compromised than any other?
Well, I have been involved in some difficult security incidents, including a physical violence, but there's no need to talk about them.
Okay. And with these things that are going on, as you say, with Sudan, it's less publicized because it has less of an impact on our lives at home compared to the Israel-Gaza conflict, which we obviously have had an involvement with, and also the Russia and Ukraine, which we also have as well. It feels to me like we're closer to a world war than I've ever known in my lifetime. You obviously, as you say, you were around during the Cold War before with that nuclear threat. How close do you think that we could be to an event like that?
I think there is an argument to say that a world war can be described that if you have multiple conflicts going on at the same time. And sometimes people even use that word to describe where we are at the moment, where there's already lots of fighting in different parts of the world. Essentially, most of them are proxies between the same powers, but the 2 or 3 powers are not actually fighting each other directly. That's already going on around in different parts of the world at the moment. To what extent is it likely that it will evolve into something where the bigger powers actually fight each other? There are flashpoints around the world where that could happen. The Korean Peninsula is one, South China Sea is another.
Taiwan.
Yeah. Russia, Ukraine, I would have said not at first, but now the way that it's evolving, it's more possible there. I don't think the Middle East crisis, for all its tragedy, is going to escalate into a world conflict, but it's another flashpoint that will exacerbate it. So you've got a lot of flashpoints in the world at the moment where there are either open tensions or simmering tensions. So it is, of course, because of that, it is very possible, but not inevitable. Nothing's inevitable.
I hope that I'm sure, as we all do, that it does de-escalate at the moment. I think for the last few years, we have seen incremental escalation. What do you think it could take to see de-escalation in a handful of these conflicts?
I don't know if you've ever read the story of Shooting an Elephant by George Orwell. It's an essay where he's stationed, or the protagonist is stationed in Burma, but that's part of British India at the time. And a male elephant sort of comes out of the jungle, runs wild through the villages, smashes a few houses, tramples on somebody, kills them. And to stop an elephant is very difficult. An aggressive male elephant, you can't just shoot it with a pistol. You need a big
blunderbuss.
Yeah, you need a big weapon. And the only one that had the weapon is the British official who's responsible, therefore, for stopping the elephant. And people run to his house and say, "Come out, you've got to stop this elephant." He gets his gun, he goes to the field. The elephant is just standing quietly, not a threat to anybody anymore. It's done its thing. But all eyes are on him, that the elephant has trampled through the villages. He's got the gun. He's got to kill the elephant. He doesn't want to kill the elephant anymore. But the expectation is so high that he's compelled to shoot. He shoots it once, doesn't kill it. Twice, still fails to kill it. 3 times, no more bullets. The elephant dies slowly. But the point of his story is that you're not always in control of events if you've created expectations that compel you to do something that you may even no longer want to do. Some of these positions, we will stand by Israel, whatever what. We will stand up to Russia, whatever what. We will defend Taiwan, whatever what. That are not about deliberation or understanding each other or peaceful negotiation, but are these uncompromising red lines that you repeat them often enough and people will expect you to pull the trigger at a certain moment if you're holding the gun. What can we do to defuse some of those tensions? We need to talk less about red lines, the enemy, more about what it takes to create acceptable peace for both sides, understanding both sides of a story. Those are the conversations that we need more of, and they needn't look like weaknesses. They should look like strengths, because they're all in all of our best interests.
It does feel, especially with the US and Russia, from my point of view, that it is an ego contest. And as you say, a show of strength could be to try and put that aside and negotiate. And obviously this US election will have a big impact on that on the global stage, not knowing which way that would go. And I think both candidates also from conversations with you, have strengths on this matter and weaknesses on this matter. And it's hard for me to ascertain which one would be better for us as a result on the global scale.
For me too.
Yeah. What has your career taught you about humanity?
You know, you'd think I'd have a great answer to that because, you know, I travel around a great deal. I've read a lot, lived in different contexts. But I think there's a truth that the more you know, the less you know. Or as Socrates put it, the only thing I know for sure is that I know nothing for sure. And it does feel that the older I get, the more I've traveled, the more I've read, the less certain I am about what you can really hold on to, apart from some values. But in terms of interpretation of events and who's wrong and who's right, etc., I actually find it harder to articulate those things with conviction now than in the past. And I think it's also tempting to ask leaders or people with, you know, biggish jobs who have responsibilities to ask those questions and expect good answers from them. But actually, leaders are some of the worst people to ask because they're always busy. They're busy dealing with crises, with people, the next presentation, the next meeting, the next board meeting, and they don't actually have a lot of time to think. If I look at my own journey, the moments in my life that really formulated my values or perspectives, they've been the quieter moments when I've had time to read and reflect, sometimes extended holidays, not actually the moments when I've been busy running around leading. Although I know there are many leaders who do feel that as they've got those titles, it entitles them to be talking a lot and sharing a lot. You know, I think that none of the good things in life that we take for granted, when I say good things, I mean human rights, peace, freedom from random arrest, the ability to be creative in your own way and not feel that you're going to be punished from it, to feel not judged by gender, by your race, by your sexual orientation. These things have all been achieved through some form of active civil participation, which have forced people in power to concede some power, largely in order to stay in power. But it has been a tension from the bottom up. There's nothing inevitable about that progress. For most of human history, it's not been there. So I would say if I've learned anything, it's that a good life should involve some form of active contribution in one way or another. There's multiple ways to do it, towards a fairer and safer world for yourself and for others. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't realize life is fragile. So we should enjoy the things that we love, whatever that is: creativity, wine, coffee, travel, meaningful relationships, and so forth.
It's an interesting point from our conversation the other night as well, actually, is that I am quite focused on self-development and personal development. And it's not my own opinion, but one that I've inherited from some other thought leaders, that the best way to change the world is just to change yourself. And perhaps getting too worried or involved in worldwide disputes, conflicts, political debates, and so on is wasting energy that you could be using to improve your own life. You are obviously a big humanitarian. It's your career, and you make a living out of trying to help make a difference on the global scale and improve life there. What truth do you think there is to change the world? You have to start by changing yourself.
I don't think it's either or. I mean, none of the big things that will affect you or your development, my development, anybody's, the big things that could change our world fundamentally at any moment, the risk of a nuclear war, the climate change that may make our world not inhabitable, surveillance from our mobile phones that gets so strong that all of our freedoms are essentially taken away. None of these big things that will shape your future are going to be handled by individuals who are only focused on their self-development, because ultimately they require collaboration, not just within communities and not just within countries, but between countries. So being aware of that, at least in terms of who you vote for, at the very least, I think is important. But that doesn't mean that you're wrong to say how important it is ultimately to be developed enough to participate well, to see risks in advance, and for the intrinsic value of living well for yourself and your loved ones, which is ultimately what it's all about. But I don't think totally stepping aside from global responsibilities is safe at the moment because there's so much at stake.
Genuinely, that's something I'm picking up from our conversations, is sort of realizing that perhaps I am focusing too much inwards in this, and I'm trying to think over what part of my life that I'm using to dedicate to trying to make the world a better place externally. And genuinely, from this conversation, that's what I'm now thinking, like, how am I going to go about starting to make a difference in community or on a bigger scale than just in my bedroom?
Well, the fact that you even have podcasts like this, who you invite on, who you choose to invite, what questions you ask, who follows you, what ideas you might stimulate in others, they're all ways of contributing.
What has been the most rewarding moment of your career, if you could pick one?
I've been so lucky in this job. It's a huge privilege. If you work for an organization like the Red Cross, you're not going to be rich, but you're going to have quite a rich life. There are many stories I could tell you. There's one that sticks out and one that I often share, and I'll just quickly summarize it here because it's an example of how this job can be so rewarding. One of my first assignments was to the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, which had just still reeling from an internal conflict with a breakaway republic of Abkhazia, and the Georgians living in Abkhazia had to migrate to Georgia for their own safety. And I was involved in trying to set up a program for them about 5 or 6 years after they'd been displaced. And the elderly community amongst them had become extremely impoverished. They were destitute. And so going from house to house, we were seeing people who were not that old, many of them in their 60s, some in their early 70s, but already almost bedbound, not because of physical inability, but just lack of will to carry on. Hungry, poor, destitute, and depressed. Instead of providing the usual food aid, we just invited them what essentially were small daytime parties where they could sort of get together, meet each other, and discuss what did they need from their government in terms of their entitlements and pensions. What did they need from their medical providers? What could they do for themselves to improve the quality of their lives? And bit by bit, those destitute, helpless people turned out to be doctors, engineers, teachers, people whose identity and pride had been subdued for years, but was still there and able to come to the surface again. That was great. But about 2 years later, after I last saw them, I got a letter. Now it would have come as a WhatsApp, but then I got it as a letter with a CD-ROM in it. And when I put it on, it was a video of one of their weddings. Two of them had married each other, and the same people that I'd met, pretty much bedbound, were dancing on the dance floor. Just, a new life, a new possibility for them. And, that was a great, proud moment. But fortunately, actually one of many, but just an example.
That's wholesome. Do you still have contact now?
I'm afraid they were passed away now.
Oh, sorry to hear. Do you think that what you've seen on the other side of the scale has perhaps desensitized you to some of the horrors of the modern world?
I mean, I didn't start naive, I don't think. I didn't feel that the world was necessarily a kind and safe place and we all should be living happily and peacefully with each other. I assumed it was troubled, conflictual, unfair, because I'm a student of history, and most of history is about violence and conflict. And the fact that we've had 70 years where mostly in Europe, obviously now it's a bit different because of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, but also what happened in the Balkans. But for most of the time, it's been relatively peaceful. That is a blip, a lucky, possibly exceptional blip that we have lived in to our great fortune. But it wasn't the only part of the world that I had studied or was familiar with. So I wasn't shocked to see that it was different. Also, to be frank, there are many parts of the world that are struggling, such as Afghanistan, or Palestine, where you find the best of humanity as well. I remember when I came back from living 6 years in Africa, I found commuting on a train in London to be the most depressing experience. Because for all Africa's challenges, it's full of smiles and optimism and laughter and dancing in the face of sometimes great, great difficulties. Whereas a squashed tube makes everybody miserable, and they don't hide it. So even when a country is struggling on the surface, it doesn't mean its humanity is subdued or compromised. On the contrary, sometimes it comes out more prominently in those environments.
Have you heard of the rock climber called Alex Honnold?
I haven't, no.
So he's one of the leading wall climbers in the world, and he's climbed the Great Wall in Yosemite, I think it's called. I can't remember the name of it, the Dawn Wall or something like that. But he climbed it without any harness, any rope or anything. He scaled, I think it was over 400 meters. I'm pulling that figure out of thin air, but it's a bloody big wall, and he climbed it, the whole thing, with no attachment. If he fell, he died. And in an interview, he was being asked like why he keeps doing these ridiculously dangerous things. Now, I think he's an extremist, and I'm not telling anyone to go and start climbing giant walls without a rope. But he said, if you don't expose yourself to real danger or real suffering or real fear, your brain will create it because it's hardwired to look for it in places. He said, I go and sit in an airport and I see families reacting to a 3-hour delayed flight like it's the end of the world. And, you know, for me, I'm just sat there like, this is nothing, because he set his threshold so much higher. And there's so much to be said for hedonic adaptation, not just in the way of hedonism, but also the other way, that if you're exposed to such cruelty or such catastrophe, that it sets your baseline quite a bit lower so that you can find so much joy in the regular day to day.
Yeah, I think that's very true.
Okay. And one more question on that front is, how have you seen catastrophe affect humanity positively?
I think in ways that we just described, really, that when everything is stripped away from you, what matters is your dignity, your loved ones, and hope. And if you can preserve those things, then suddenly it doesn't matter quite so much that you haven't got your TV or some other luxury that you've been enjoying. But it takes a shock to make you realize what matters most. So I generally find that, although of course there are extremes, which are extremes. So if you see people who are extremely hungry, there's no joy in that, you know, and there's actually no dignity in that. It's a very terrible thing to be rolled over in pain because of hunger. And if you see people who've just come out of fresh from bombing or near-death experiences, of course, they are also extremely traumatized. Those most extreme moments are just what you'd expect them to be, shocking and terrifying. But generally, stress, if lived through, and if you have been fortunate enough to sort of stay with your loved ones and physically stay healthy, it can also be a stark reminder of what's important, and solidarity with your neighbors, mutual aid, the appreciation for what you've got, those things sort of rise to the surface in those moments.
That's huge. I told you this story the other day that I have a friend who's an air hostess, and they flew a plane into Egypt that was pretty much stripped out to collect some refugees from the Gaza crisis. And they had to stay on the plane. They landed on the runway. Everyone was waiting there with their bags, straight onto the plane and off in the air again, obviously for safety. The thing that stuck out to her was how much gratitude that there was on that plane for the smallest things, like passing a woman a blanket, and she was thanking, you know, so much, handing a young boy a drink. To have gone from such an extreme catastrophe, just the smallest things, it really puts life in perspective.
Yeah, very much so.
And I think we're spoilt a lot in the West. You know, I've personally been lucky enough to have never experienced any global catastrophe firsthand. And I think it would be a bit of a wake-up call for me, and perhaps stop me from taking some of the things for granted that I do.
Still, I hope you don't have to face it. But as you were giving, as you said with your friend, the climber, there are other ways you can take yourself out of your comfort zone and remind yourself of what's important.
Definitely. How do you switch off? What do you do in your spare time?
So, I mean, I have I've always wanted to write a book. I mean, I really wanted to in my 20s, but somehow life took over, and I thought, well, I'll write it when I've got more to say because I've lived more. And then the time never came. But there was a moment when I was in Greece about 5-6 years ago. This was at the time of the refugee crisis where people were coming from Syria. And I took the opportunity to look into the history of the Greek side of my family and to try to find out how my grandfather had died in the Second World War, because there were lots of stories. There's a monument to him in the town where he died, newspaper articles, and nice local legends, but none of them which sounded entirely true. So I took it upon myself to do the research, and then I wrote a small non-fiction book as a gift for my father that explained what actually happened. But while I was doing that, I found old postcards and photographs from the generation before that, my great-grandfather's generation, who were involved in 10 years of conflict in 1912 to 1922, when Greece was involved in 3 consecutive wars, when it fought the Ottoman army to kick them out of the Balkans, when it was involved in the First World War, and then when it fought what became Turkey. It wasn't Turkey at the time, it was still the Ottoman Empire, but Turkey was formed out of that conflict in 1919 to 1921. And this intrigued me as a sort of subplot of history, which is little known, but actually changed the world in some ways, because the Balkan conflict of 1912-1913 triggered the First World War, and the Asia Minor War formed the current borders of the shape of Turkey and therefore of Europe. And a story began to form in my mind about how that could become the novel that I'd always wanted to write. And I very loosely took 3 examples of my grandfather, 2 of his brothers, 3 different types of men. One, a conservative, former military, nationally loyal Greek who believed in a great Greek mission. One, more of a liberal intellectual who'd spent his time in Paris and was quite dubious about the nationalist agenda that Greece was pushing at the time. And one, just a hedonist who wanted to eat, drink, womanize, and live each day for its full. Then I threw all 3 of them into this sort of porridge of the Balkans in 1912-1913, which was being turned upside down by this first conflict, and had them explore their own journeys for purpose and their own love journeys as well. 3 very different ones. And that became a labor of love for me for 3 years of writing and 1 year of editing. So I finished my first novel then, and then I wanted to publish it, but I didn't know how to enter that world of publishing, and I started writing short stories as a way of entering competitions, all based on this island of Egina where I spend my summers just outside Athens. And I didn't intend to write the second book, but I wrote a second one, which is a collection of short stories, all set in the modern day, but based on an ancient myth and an ancient sort of curse that the nymph Egina made on the island of Egina against Zeus, and I have it affecting people in the summer of 2023. So that was my big hobby for years, writing, and I now need to publish these 2 books. One of them was shortlisted for an international competition, but still not published yet. But I'm going to push for that now. But it has taught me something very important, that creativity is such a joy in life. If you've got something you can do that's not your full-time job, but brings out the creative side of yourself, it uses a different part of your brain, different part of your heart maybe, and is extremely fulfilling. So that's my main hobby.
I love that. If there are any publishers listening, then please reach out and I will send you Alex's way.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I think the work that you do is incredible, and I've really loved talking to you, and you genuinely have opened my eyes to making an impact on a wider scale. So thank you for that. If anyone is listening and they wanted to get involved with the Red Cross or do some charity work themselves, is there any particular way they could find the Red Cross?
Well, one, thank you, Thomas, for inviting me. It's been great to talk to you. And in answer to that question, every country in the world has a Red Cross or a Red Crescent. And if you are willing to give time or money or clothes or blood to support the work of the Red Cross or the Red Crescent, they'd love to hear from you. Just reach out to whichever one is in your community.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.